Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Typical Purim, we dress up and we celebrate and let the kids parade around the sanctuary and tell the story of Esther, about a woman who fought anti-Semitism by showing the king that the Jewish people are human beings too. People worthy of love, people worthy of respect, and at least minimally maybe, worthy of simple protection from other human beings, people filled with hate. I love the book of Esther for precisely these reasons, and I think about it not just at Purim, but I find myself thinking about it throughout the year because there are so many times where the world feels unjust, and what we want to do is tear it apart, and that's not what Esther does. Esther is smart and patient. She's persuasive and strategic. In my mind, she's like an ancient version of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, able to fight the long fight, able to reach out and help other people understand where they've gone wrong and how they can change. She saved her people, our people, mostly with her mind, depending on how closely you read the text, perhaps a little bit with her body. But she did it thoughtfully, with patience, and with a concern for humanity. But the part that we conveniently do not read in front of our children is the end of the book of Esther. Sometimes we will get to the part in the story where Haman is killed rather than the planned Mordecai. But we almost never get to the reaction of the Jewish people. The Jewish people actually play a very important part in the story in the last two chapters. And so that's what I am choosing to read this evening. I think you'll see why. Why we leave it out, why it's important, and why we should struggle with it on a year when Purim is not what it normally is, where we aren't dressed up, where we aren't joking in the sanctuary and having a celebration. I figured this year, let's look seriously at the Megillah and the parts that we usually skip. And let's see what they have to teach us. Before we read the Megillah, I first want to say that the Megillah that we'll be reading is this beautiful Megillah that Mike and Bobby Sachs have given to the congregation. I know you can't see the words. It is a reprint of a 17th century Italian Megillah. It's beautifully decorated and written, and it's a great honor. They gifted this to us just over a year ago, and so it's a great honor, and we thank them for being able to read this from our Bima. First, the blessings for reading from this story. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mikra Megillah. Thank you, God, for allowing us to have the moment to read this Megillah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim la'avotenu bayamin hahem bazman hazeh. Thank you, God, for allowing us to see that in our current world we have miracles just as we did during the time of Esther. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Thank you for bringing us to this moment and for allowing us to share the story of the Megillah together. I'm reading just a few verses from beginning in the middle of chapter 9 of the Megillah. At this point in the story, we're usually finished, as I shared. Haman, you can boo from home. Haman has been already mostly taken care of. The Jewish people are safe. And we finally find out what the reaction is. Nakalu haYehudim ba'areihem b'chol medinat hamelech Achashverosh. All of the Jewish people in the towns gathered together if they lived in a town under King Ahasuerus. Lishlach yad b'mavkashe ra'item. And they sent their hand out. They went after all of those who were their enemies. V'ish lo amad bifnehem ki nafal pachdam al kol ha'amim, and every single person was afraid of them. And so no one would go against this Jewish crowd. V'chol sharei hamedinot, all of the leaders under the king, v'ha'achad hash drafnim, v'hachpachot, v'osi hamalacha asher lamelech menasim et haYehudim. And all of the leaders under King Ahasuerus, they would follow whatever the Jewish crowd would say. Ki nafal pachad Mordechai aleihem, because they were afraid of Mordechai before them. Ki gadol Mordechai beveit hamelech, for Mordechai had become a very powerful person under the king. V'sham'u holech b'chol hamedinot, and his reputation preceded him. Everywhere that he went, people knew how powerful Mordechai was. Vayechu haYehudim b'chol oiveihem, and the Jewish people went after all of their enemies. Makat charev, killing them by the sword, v'charag, and murdering them, v'evron, and destroying them, v'ya'asu bisnehem kirtzonam, and they treated them however they wanted to treat them. Uvashushan habira, in the palace of Shushan, hargu haYehudim, the Jewish people killed, ve'eved chamesh ma'ot ish, 500 men. And so we can see, this is not the story we tell our children. For in the beginning of the Megillah, we talk about how we control our emotions, how we have patience and educate those in power. At the end of the Megillah, it seems to be about how great the power is that Mordechai has grabbed, about how afraid people are of him. We seem to celebrate that no one would ever challenge any of the Jewish people, because we punish our enemies so harshly that we instill fear in those around us, and our reputation precedes us. We don't read the end of the Megillah to our children because we don't like it. And yet, it holds out a deep human truth. When the abuse we have received is over, when the good guys have won, when the bad guys are punished, we aren't always satisfied. We're not always able to simply close the door on what we experienced and say it's over. Last week, our educator Lauren asked me to share a story with our religious school kids about what strength means in the book of Esther. You can make the argument reading these last chapters that what strength means is that people are afraid of you. I chose yet again, though, not to share the last chapters of the Megillah. Instead, I told them a story that I learned from a psychologist. The psychologist walked around a room while teaching stress management to an audience. And she raised a glass of water. This is an exercise she would do often. And everyone expected the psychologist to ask whether the glass was half full or half empty. But instead, with a smile on her face, she said, "I want to know from you, how heavy is the glass of water?" And so people started answering from all over the audience. They called out a range, 8 ounces from one person. No, it's 20 ounces from another person, all trying to judge how heavy would a glass of water be. And she replied, "The absolute weight of the water doesn't matter. It depends on how long I hold it. That's how heavy it is. If I hold it for a minute, it's not heavy at all. If I hold it for an hour, I'll have an ache in my arm. If I hold it for a day, my arm will feel numb and paralyzed. In each case, the weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes." And she shared, "The stresses and worries in life are like that glass of water. Think about them for a while, nothing happens. Think about them for a lot longer, they begin to hurt. And if you think about them all day long, you will feel paralyzed, incapable of doing anything. And so, remember to put down the glass." We read the first 8 chapters of the Megillah, and it is a heroic story of a woman who saves her people. You read the last 2 chapters, and it is about a people who could not save themselves from themselves. In the wake of the Holocaust, a much more tragic modern-day version of our Megillah, in which the story did not go our way. There was no Esther to save us before we were to be killed. In the wake of that moment, Rabbi Alexander Schindler wrote a powerful sermon as he reflected on what the Holocaust meant years after it had ended. He claimed that there were 2 primary lessons that we, the Jewish people, must learn from the most painful times in our history. First, he said, we must never take our survival for granted. We must resist anti-Semitism early, when it appears in casual language, and when we hear the subtleties among our leaders. We must remember that words matter, and we must remember, as he wrote, that survival is the best defense for us. It is, in fact, he said, the sole revenge. The only worthy response to those who seek our destruction is to show them that we, in fact, have and will continue to survive. I find that we continue to be quite good at this. Our ears are trained to hear anti-Semitism, and Jewish organizations respond quickly with a bold voice so that the world knows we are listening. The second lesson that Schindler said we should take from our tragedies is to remember that we're not the only ones who suffer. And this lesson, I find, is more difficult to practice. We hold the glass up so long that when we allow our pain and suffering to be the forefront of our mind, and we allow it sometimes to become our identity. We do this sometimes as individuals, but we've done this as a people. Barry Weiss wrote over a year ago, as she wrote about anti-Semitism, that too often we as Jewish people are only defined by anti-Semites. And as individuals, we allow our lives to be defined by the suffering that we've endured, whatever that suffering is. As I told the religious school kids, true strength is not found in holding up the glass of water for a long time. True strength is found in having the courage to put the glass down. Don't you think we would tell the last 2 chapters of the book of Esther if they were about how the Jewish people looked forward, didn't go after their enemies to kill them, but rather found a way to put the glass down, to reach out to those who had suffered along their side, to be human with other people and an example? We would definitely tell that part of the story. And so my prayer is, on this strangely quiet Purim and Shabbat, that we take the time to hear the last chapters of this scroll and to rewrite them for ourselves so that we can be like Esther, patient and persuasive, protecting our people, but also be able to be better than the unnamed Jewish crowds in the book. May we set aside our grudges, our pains, and our suffering in order to see that it is not us against the world, but rather us among a world that is all too familiar with a story like ours, because so often people in the world, their stories are quite similar to ours as well. We have more in common than we have in opposition. Shabbat Shalom.